We didn't have a separate children's story today because what I want to share with you today is one big story. And it's an incredible story. It's an amazing story. And kids, I promise you that it is way better than any fairy tale that you might hear. It's a story that's filled with mad men, beautiful women, war, murder. Did you say murder? Yes, it has murder in it. Oh, my microphone's not on. Yes, it is. Turn it up louder. Turn the gain up. It's filled with murder. It's filled with twists and turns in the plot. It is so complicated. But I want to encourage you to pay attention, because there are so many powerful lessons, so many powerful things to help us understand all sorts of things. Let's start off with a question, and it's a hard question. Why are you here? And I'm not just talking about why are you here in church today. That's part of the question. But I'm also talking about the big picture. Why are you here? What is your purpose? What is the reason for your existence at this time? Why are you here in the world today, now? And I'm not going to be able to answer that question for you. I'm sorry. But I'm going to give you some thoughts, share with you some ideas that might lead you in the right direction, that will help you reconcile your existence. Now, let's start with some history. The year was 480 BC. Can I have the first picture up of my PowerPoint presentation, please? The year was 480 BC. I love history, you know that. And the massive Persian army marched with determination to face the rebel forces of Athens and its Greek allies. Persia against the Greek powers. Ancient sources number the Persians at around 1 million soldiers. Our modern sources hedge on that a little bit and think it might have been some hundreds of thousands. In any case, Persia was putting on a massive military display. At the time, the Persian Empire stretched from modern-day Libya in Africa all the way to Pakistan in Asia. It was the largest empire in history and the second great empire after the Babylonian Empire. You remember the statue in the king's dream, Daniel's dream, you know, the head of gold, the shoulders of silver. This is the Persian Empire. This is empire number 2. The best we can tell, there were about 50 million people in the Persian Empire of that day. And they had conquered the Babylonian Chaldean Empire in 539 BC. Again, remembering back to Daniel, the hand that appeared in the banquet and wrote words on the wall in front of the king, and the king was afraid and called Daniel in. What does this mean? And Daniel says, mate, you've stuffed up. You've been found wanting. This is the end. And that kingdom fell that very night. That was the night that the Persians conquered the Babylonians and the end of the Babylonian Empire and the significant rise of the Persian Empire. The Persians settled into domination in the Middle Eastern world, and it lasted for 200 years before they were replaced by the Greeks, who were later replaced by the Romans. But initially, the regions of Greece had been conquered by the Persians under Darius, and that would be back in sort of 550 BC and the few years following that, Darius' armies had been defeated by the Athenians at the famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Now you know about the Battle of Marathon, you know how we run marathon races today. It's from that battle that we get the name of the race. All right? There was this guy called Phidippides that when the battle was over, he had to take the news back to Athens about who had won the battle, and he ran. And he ran 26 miles, and that's where we get our 26 mile or 42.125 kilometres for a marathon today. Darius was determined to subdue his Greek enemies. He had real problems winning, and he amasses a great, great army. And he's going back. He's going to pay the Greeks back for winning the battle at Marathon, that famous battle. So the king has in great intentions to satisfy his thirst for vengeance. However, he dies before he could exact his vengeance on the Greeks. So the quest for his vengeance fell to his son. Now this man's name is Xerxes. And that's a name that we've heard before too, isn't it? Xerxes lives from 519 BC through to 465 BC. He comes to real power in 486. Before that, he was just the governor of Babylon, but now he's the emperor of the Persian Empire. He wasn't Darius' oldest son, but I think he was the third son, if I remember correctly. And he takes this throne, and his first order of business is to deal with the Egyptians because they're giving him trouble, and he has to subdue them first. So he's unable right away to set his sights on Greece to wreak the vengeance of his father on them. But by the year 481, he's ready to attack. So Xerxes gets together to get vengeance on the Greeks for what they did during his father's reign. He gets together an army of 250,000 men, and they're stacked in modern-day Turkey. And they're waiting for orders to cross that tiny little piece of water into Greece. And they're making plans on how they're going to do this. And they do it. Things, however, didn't go as Xerxes had expected. His armies reach Athens and they sack the city. The Athenians run away, they burn the place down. But the Greeks ultimately defeat the Persians and drive them back out of Greece. And there's some very famous battles. The Battle of Thermopylae, have you heard of that one? Where the 300 Spartans stay in the pass and prevent the huge Persian army from going past. 300 men for days, just shoulder to shoulder, across from the steep cliff on one side to the ocean on the other side. And the huge Persian army could not pass. Then there's the Battle of Salamis, where the Persian navy is completely obliterated by the Greeks. They lost over 300 warships. The Greeks lured them into this tiny, tiny little harbour area, and the Persians had these huge warships, and the Greeks had these tiny little warships. And in these closed quarters, the small Greek warships were so much more manoeuvrable, and that was the end of the Persian navy. All of that simply to say that there is battle history going on between the Persians, the reigning world empire, and the Greeks who are about to take possession of the world as the next great world empire. See, Xerxes fights repeatedly against the Greeks, and he has some small measures of success, but more defeat than success. And finally, a man comes along by the name of Alexander the Great, who was a Greek, and the Persian Empire was defeated for good. He's the son of Philip of Macedon, the Macedonian king, and Alexander the Great conquers the Middle Eastern world and establishes what we know as the Great Greek Empire. Now, the emperor that the Greeks called Xerxes and that I've been talking about has a different name in Persian. In Persian, his name is Kashayasha. And in Hebrew, it's really hard to say, Akashverosh. And in your Bible, his name is Ahasuerus. And that's the name you're going to find that they call him in the book of Esther. The king in the book of Esther is none other than Xerxes, the son of Darius, who fought the Greeks and ultimately lost the Persian Empire to the power of the Greeks. This is the man who tried to conquer Greece with 250,000 soldiers. This is the man, Ahasuerus, the king in the book of Esther, who is the one who becomes the ruler of that empire after the death of his father, and he is the man who has his heart conquered by this little Jewish orphan named Esther. And when the opportunity came, she would use her influence to save the Jewish race from genocide. That's the story of Esther, how one woman, through the providence of God, saved the Jews from genocide. The book has her name, not because she wrote it. We don't know who wrote it. Maybe Mordecai wrote it. Her cousin. Maybe Ezra wrote it. Maybe Nehemiah wrote it. Or some other Jew that was dwelling at the time in Persia. Somebody who understood the Persian scene and somebody who also understood Jewish culture. Someone who had a detailed knowledge of both, but whoever the author is, the real author of the story is God. Behind this richly played out labyrinth of events is divine providence. So let's start at the beginning of the book. If you've got your Bibles with you, you can open with me, open to chapter 1. And at times we're going to move fairly rapidly. The book opens by describing the expansive kingdom of Ahasuerus. It stretches from Ethiopia, as I said, to the edges of India, all the way from modern Libya to Pakistan. He's not only the son of Darius, he's the grandson of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great, the Persian ruler, who decreed that the Jews could go back to their land after 70 years of captivity. And that's how the book of Esther starts. Many Jews actually went back to Israel. Under the decree of Cyrus, the grandfather of Xerxes, they went back and they began to rebuild their city of Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple, the second temple. They re-established themselves in the land. However, there were a large number of people, those Jewish people who'd been exiled to Babylon, who remained there. They settled, they scattered, they proliferated, and they were all through the Persian Empire. Several years into the reign of Ahasuerus or Xerxes, the book of Esther opens when he calls a 6-month war summit in the capital city of Shushan, or Susa as it's called. This occurred in 483 BC. And this is a strategic war planning meeting, a 6-month war strategy session. And what is this about? The king is going to make his final preparations for the invasion of Greece that I told you about, which was unsuccessful. But he's going to make his plans. He's confident in his ability to knock off Greece, confident that his military forces are going to be triumphant. So he ends the 6-month summit of military planning with a 7-day party. Now look at your Bible and look at Esther chapter 1 and see the extravagant celebration. This is celebration that is held in anticipation of the victory that they're going to have. In this party room, they had white and blue linen curtains. Verse 6, fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. The couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. They served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. This is a 7-day drunken orgy, if you will. On the 7th day of the feast, Ahasuerus, after a week of intoxication and indulgence, decides that he wants to put his wife on display. Not a nice fella, is he? Not a wise fella. Her name is Vashti, Queen Vashti. So he commands his wife to show up on the 7th day and present herself in her royal regalia. Well, surprisingly, she says, I'm not coming to your party, mate. Evidently concerned that her dignity would be tarnished when she appeared before a crowd of mostly men who were mostly drunk, she doesn't go. And some have suggested that she might have been pregnant with their son, a man named Xerxes, again another name familiar to history. She was uncomfortable with being seen in public and she said, I'm not coming. Ahasuerus is furious. This is public insubordination. This is public embarrassment to him. This is making him look bad in the royal court, as well as all the people that were there. And according to chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, he's afraid that the Queen's actions will start a women's liberation movement. That if the Queen can get away with this, then every woman is going to do this. So he demotes her. That's it. She's no longer the Queen. He spreads the word that from now on, she's through. He announces his intention then that he's going to get a new queen. He's going to get a new queen, and he makes it very clear that no one can disobey the king, not even the queen, or she will be deposed and replaced. End of story. Ahasuerus, by the way, has a violent temper. And it displayed itself in this action against his queen. You know, just a year later from this, in order for his massive army to march from Turkey, they were assembled, as I said, into Greece. Ahasuerus ordered that bridges be built across the Hellespont. Now, you know where the Hellespont is there in Turkey? It's where Asia Minor and Europe come together, and there's that tiny little bit of water that separates those two land masses from each other. That part of the world has a rich history in our own Australian history. It's where Gallipoli is, the Dardanelles. Okay, this part of the world, because it is where Europe and Asia join, has been key for many, many thousands of years. And this is the same spot where Xerxes needs to cross over from Asia, from Persia, into Europe, into Greece. So he calls his engineers in, and they build a bridge of boats across the Hellespont. And before they get to use it, a storm comes and sinks the boats, and that's the end of the bridge. And Xerxes, it just drives him wild. So he calls all the engineers together and said, you lot, you're pretty useless. That's it. That's the end of you. And he has them all beheaded because he believes that they didn't build the bridge properly. They didn't build the bridge strong enough. So it's their fault. That's the end of them. Then he calls more of his soldiers together. He gets the military police in and says, righto guys, we're going to do this as well. It's partly the sea's fault. So I want all of you to go into the ocean with your whips and I want you to beat the sea. True story, there were photographers there then to take photos. Okay, so the military police were in the water beating the ocean. And then he thought, no, this is not enough. So he had rods of iron heated up till it was red hot. And he had these fellas stab the waves with these red hot irons to punish the ocean for what it had done to him. And then he had them throw shackles into the water to bind the ocean, to prevent it from doing these bad things to him again. This is irrational rage, obviously. This may be a bit of an explanation for the way he treated his queen the way he did. Not a balanced individual, is he? Bit of a madman. See, I told you this story had madmen in it. 4 years pass. There's no queen. And according to Esther chapter 2 verse 16, 4 years pass before he gets around to selecting a new queen. Why 4 years? The answer is found in his 2-year unsuccessful invasion of Greece. The very thing we opened by talking about, the invasion of Greece, happens in that 2 years, and it occupies him so that he can't deal with the issue of establishing a new queen. And Persia's 2-year unsuccessful invasion of Greece historically fits right between Vashti's demotion in 483, 482, and then Esther's coronation in 479 or 478. Remember, we're going backwards now because we're BC. And finally, he's so frustrated by his inability to conquer Greece that he comes back home after 2 years of effort and decides that since this war is going so terribly badly, he needs a distraction, and that distraction will be selecting a new queen. If you look at chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, it says, "After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, 'Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins into Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women.'" That's a harem, in case you were wondering. "And let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. Okay, so this is going to be an empire-wide beauty contest. Okay? Donald Trump was not the first one to come up with the idea of Miss Universe. We can make a general sort of assumption that if there were 50 million people in the Persian Empire, there are 25 million women to pick from. 25 million. That's the scene. At that point, the biblical text introduces us to the two main people in the story. Two Jewish people who were cousins. They live in the city of Shushan as well, and they are descendants of the original Jewish captives that were taken by Nebuchadnezzar into the Babylonian captivity. They were brought to Babylon a century earlier, or their parents were, I should say, brought a century earlier, around 597 and the years following. The older of the two is a man named Mordecai, and he's roughly 15 years older than his young cousin, an orphan named Esther. Verse 7 says that her parents had died when she was very young, so Mordecai had raised her. So here in the middle of 50 million people in the Persian Empire are these two Jewish people. Her name in Hebrew is Hadassah, and it means myrtle, the plant, the tree that flowers, the beautiful purple flowers. Her Persian name is Esther, and it may be related to Ishtar one of the Babylonian goddesses, and it may also be, because of its similarity, the Persian word for star or for stars. So she may have been named Star, or she may have been named after the Babylonian goddess, who just happened to be the goddess of love. And that was not her Jewish name, but the Jews in exile were given Persian names, like Daniel and his 3 friends. Daniel's 3 friends, what were their original names? Azariah, Hananiah, Mishael, but they became Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Babylonian names. That was the custom. Now, the Bible text, look at chapter 2, verse 7, says that it just so happened that this young virgin by the name of Esther was lovely and beautiful. And she didn't go unnoticed by the king's officials. So she was collected in the group that were to go to the palace and live in the harem with the concubines and participate in the Miss Universe pageant, the contest for the queen. You know, Josephus the historian says that there were 400 virgins who were taken into the palace, 400. The thing that went from whatever the amount of women that they saw at first down to the 400 most beautiful women, and then they were taken into the palace because they were going to be there for a year, and they were going to be allowed to kind of work on themselves for a year, although they were already beautiful. And then at some point, when the year was over, they would be presented to the king, and he would be able to make his choice, and one of them would be elevated to the position of queen. They had a year of primping. Now for me, that'd be pretty boring. That's not my scene. It seems unnecessarily long to get fixed up, doesn't it? But I don't know exactly what might have gone on. I dare say there were baths in ass's milk and slices of cucumber over eyes and avocado packs. I don't know. But a year of beautification. They were to look as beautiful as possible. They were to smell as good as possible. They were to use incense and cosmetics. They were to enhance their skin. They were to enhance their hair. They were to develop pleasant fragrances. They were to be given special instruction in court etiquette. How do you act in the imperial court? And what of all the expectations were for someone who was around royalty? This intensive training, as I said, was to go on for 12 months. And at the end of that 12 months, each of these 400 women would have one opportunity to make an impression on the king to be selected as queen. At the time, she would then adorn herself with whatever jewellery and whatever apparel she desired, and she would be presented to the ruler. And then, once that was done, she would go back into the pool of waiting ladies, other concubines, members of the royal harem, until the king had worked his way through the 400 candidates and made his choice. Esther, likely in her late teens, maybe early 20s, she has completed the year-long order, and it's her turn to appear before Ahasuerus. Chapter 2, verse 16. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther. He loved Esther more than all the other women. She must have been a very special lady, because after you've seen hundreds, I'm sure it could all kind of blur. How do you stand out from hundreds? You know, the first 3, 5, 15, 20, you would say, wow. By the time you got to 250, what did 132 look like again? And she obtained grace and favour in his sight more than all the other virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. This is like a Cinderella story, isn't it? Esther stole the king's heart and Esther became his queen. An obscure Jewish orphan, a child of exiled people, a conquered people, is exalted to the highest position that any woman could have in the entire world at the time. This is not a coincidence, my friends. There's a power working here that is far greater than Ahasuerus, right? There's a power at work providentially, orchestrating his own purposes through the affections of the emperor. Significantly, through this entire process, Esther keeps her Jewishness secret. And Mordecai told her to do so because there was much anti-Semitism in the Persian Empire. And Esther would reveal that she was Jewish, but only at the very and most important and necessary time. So Esther was chosen to be queen. She'd gone from being an obscure little Jewish orphan girl to being the queen. And it's all driven by her physical beauty and the charm that she was able to place over the emperor in the short time that she had to make an impression on him. Not long after Esther was crowned, and this is where the story starts to get even more complicated and fascinating, her cousin Mordecai is sitting at the entrance to the palace. He's hanging around the palace. Why do you think? Who raised Esther? Mordecai. He's concerned about her, so he hangs around the palace to get whatever word he can from her and about her. And while he's hanging around the palace, verse 21 tells us, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Mordecai overhears the plot, a plot to kill the king, to assassinate the king. And these were royal officials who guarded the king's private quarters. They had access to him and they could readily kill him if they wanted. They were angry. Maybe they were angry because of what he'd done to Vashti. You don't know. Maybe she was a relative of theirs. Whatever it was that infuriated them, they were plotting to take his life. And Mordecai just happens to overhear this. This indicates to us that Mordecai was in places in the palace that would have been off limits for most people, and that somehow he had been able to gain a place in the palace where he could hear conversations like this, which is a good indication that maybe he held some kind of official position of prominence in the imperial government, perhaps solicited for him by Esther. When he learnt about the plot against the king, he reported it immediately, and the message is, so the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows. And listen to this. and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. The Persians kept records of absolutely everything. They wrote everything down. The king kept a diary. That's why we know so much about the Persians' history today. And the king's chroniclers recorded what had happened, the plot, that it had been overheard by Mordecai, and that Mordecai had informed Esther, and Esther had informed the king, and the king's life has been spared, and the two conspirators were hanged. Why did they do that? Why did they write it down? Because those kinds of things need to be rewarded. And kings knew that. Loyalty needed to be rewarded as much as disloyalty needed to be punished. If you want people to tell you the information that you need to know, you have to reward them, yes? And at a future day, there would come a time when this man would be rewarded for saving the life of the king. Like all ancient monarchs, Ahasuerus was careful to honour and reward those who demonstrated loyalty to him. And that's how he secured that kind of loyalty. Now, all of that, there's Mordecai telling Esther to go and tell the king. All of that is very important to remember in our story, the writing down. Now we move into chapter 3, and you're introduced to the next main character in the book, which is a man named Haman. He's a baddie. Does he look like a baddie? He's a baddie. This is a man who had been exalted by the king. A capable man, a Persian man, a man who had been lifted up above other princes and other royal officials. But there's something very interesting and important about this man, and this is key to the whole story. He was an Agagite. Do you know what an Agagite is? It says that in chapter 3 verse 1 and chapter 3 verse 10, and it says it again in chapter 8, and it says it again in chapter 9. It says Haman the Agagite. Haman the Agagite. It keeps repeating it. It's not a small detail. It's the origin of Haman's hatred for Mordecai and his hatred of the Jews. To understand why it's important to know that he was an Agagite, let's go back a little bit. Let's go back about 1,000 years to the Exodus from Egypt. The Israelites, came out of Egypt around 1445 BC, some people say. So we're nearly 1,000 years before our story here. And they're attacked in the 17th chapter of Exodus by the Amalekites. Do you remember that name? The Amalekites? The Amalekites attacked the Israelites. The Amalekites were the descendants of Esau, the one who sold his birthright. Because the Amalekites attacked the people of Israel, God curses the Amalekites. And God's curse in Deuteronomy 25 says, one day they're going to be extinct. God pronounces a curse on the Amalekites. 4 centuries later, after the Exodus, King Saul conquers the Amalekites. You remember that story? If you look it up in 1 Samuel, it's there. And he captures their king. And their king's name is Agag. King Agag. 1 Samuel. King Agag, the Amalekite king. And Saul is supposed to kill Agag. But he didn't do it. He let him live. And Saul incurred the Lord's displeasure. And for that and for other things that he displeased the Lord, the throne was removed from Saul's family. And the prophet Samuel stepped in. Do you remember what Samuel did with Agag? 1 Samuel 15. The same little Samuel that we know the story of so well, where he walks into Eli's bedroom and, "Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. Samuel hacks Agag to death. Samuel hacks Agag to pieces. Haman was an Agagite. How do you think the Agagites feel about the Jews? Even though almost a millennium has passed from the original curse and hundreds of years have passed since the hacking of Agag, Haman knew his family history. And he knew that it was a Jewish man, a Jewish prophet by the name of Samuel, who had hacked his royal ancestor to pieces. And to make it worse, Mordecai was a descendant of Kish. That's in Esther chapter 2, verse 5. Kish is from the tribe of Benjamin. And Benjamin is the line of Saul. They knew their history, and there was deep-seated animosity between the descendants of Saul and the descendants of Agag for obvious reasons. Though nearly 550 years had passed. Both Haman and Mordecai, Haman the Agagite and Mordecai the Benjamite, had not forgotten the tribal feud that was so ancient. Hostility erupts. Chapter 3. Look at verse 2. We'll read verse 2 and then down to verse 5 and 6. And it says, all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him. He had been elevated so high that everybody had to bow down to him, but Mordecai wouldn't bow down or pay homage. That feud settled in his heart deeply, and he had nothing but animosity towards the accursed Amalekite descendant. When Haman saw that Mordecai didn't bow or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. And he decided that he couldn't just kill Mordecai, or Mordecai's people would come and kill him. So he's just going to kill all of them. That's the plan. So what does Haman do? He goes to the magicians and the astrologers and he says, I want you to determine for me the optimum day by looking into your mystical sources. I want you to read your tea leaves. I want you to look at the chicken's entrails. And I want you to work out for me the best day to annihilate the Jewish people. And we'll have genocide all through the Persian Empire on that one day. Then he goes to the king. And he says, this nation, this Persian Empire, is full of Jews, and they are trouble. They are a threat to the empire. They are a threat to your throne, and they ought to be eliminated. We need to get rid of them. He says, really, they ought to be killed all the way back to Israel. We need to go all the way back to Israel and kill all of them, even those who've returned. And he says, furthermore, if we kill them all, we can confiscate all their property and all their spoils and everything they own. And just think how much richer, O king, you will become when you take ownership of everything that was theirs. And Ahasuerus says, oh, great idea. And he hands his signet ring over to Haman so that Haman can stamp that ring on the documents that will authorize the genocide of the Jews. Haman hits the fast track. He dispatches a royal decree, sends it all throughout the empire, and they did it as fast as they could. Horses rode near and far with the message that a date had been established. If you look at verse 13 of Esther 3, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, all of them. In verse 3 of chapter 4, it says, in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. The message stretched across the massive Persian Empire very rapidly that a date had been set for the people in all their own local areas to slaughter the Jews. When Mordecai heard about this genocidal decree, he tore his clothes, he dressed in rags, he put ashes on his head, and he mourned openly. He mourned publicly at this horrendous act, the mass murder of the entire Jewish population. Was this just simple payback by Haman? No, it's much bigger than that. Satan's involved in this. Satan is involved in efforts to obliterate the Jewish people and thus to bring a halt to God's purpose of redemption on their behalf. Well, it didn't take long for the news to reach Esther. She gets the message. Mordecai informs Esther of what Haman has succeeded in accomplishing and even gives her a copy of the royal decree, and he says to her, Esther, you have to go to the king to plead for the lives of your people. Simple enough? Not so simple. In Persia, no one, not even the queen, went before the king without a personal invitation. Anybody who ventured to go into the presence of the king without being invited could be killed on the spot. Esther would not only be breaking royal protocol, she would be risking her life. If you look at chapter 4, verse 11, it says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except for the one to whom the king holds out his golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself, Esther says, have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. The king had not seen his wife, his queen, for 30 days. She was afraid of potentially violating her irrational husband, who had demoted Vashti for one act of non-compliance, who had stabbed the ocean waves with red-hot irons because they wouldn't do what he wanted them to do. And Mordecai was asking Esther to put herself in a position where she could lose her life with this irrational man. Well, Mordecai comes back and he calls for courage. Look at verses 13 and 14, chapter 4. Famous verses. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews when that day comes, Mordecai warned his royal cousin. Look, you're dead if you do, and you're dead if you don't. They're going to find out you're Jewish, and you are going to be dead, even if you don't do anything. So don't think you are going to escape. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from Jews in another place. He's going out on the limb here, isn't he? You and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether, this is so famous, isn't it? Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. My friends, what is the purpose in your life? If a little orphan girl can become the queen and be in the right place at the right time. You know, God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther. It's one of 2 books in the Bible where God's name is not mentioned. But the greatest character in this story is God. His hand is in everything that happens. Let's go on with the story. It still gets even more complicated yet. So down in verse 16, embracing her divinely granted role, we read in verse 16, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me," she says. "Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, day or night. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Even if it cost her her life, she will do what she can to protect her people." For 3 days, she and the others prayed and fasted. Her maids very likely would have been other Jewish girls who joined her in that prayer. Then she approaches the throne. It must have been a tense moment. The seconds that she waited to see whether the king would extend his scepter to her and welcome his beautiful queen into his presence. To underscore his response, she steps closer to him. Chapter 5 and verse 3, she comes and he looked at her and he extends the scepter and he asks a question in typical royal hyperbole. "What do you wish, O Queen Esther? What is your request? It will be given to you up to half the kingdom." Wow. Again, he is wowed by her beauty and her presence. She doesn't want half the kingdom. She doesn't want any of the kingdom. She just wants the lives of her people. So her request is simple. Here's her reply. She asks Ahasuerus to come to a banquet for Haman and him later that day. Well, he had to do what he offered to do. He said to her, "You can have anything you want, up to half the kingdom." And now she says, "Come for afternoon tea." He has to say, "Yeah, righto, we'll be there. We'll be there." The king, the queen, and Haman. If you look at Esther 5 verses 5 to 8, so the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said again to Esther, "What is your petition? It will be granted to you. What is your request?" Again, "Up to half the kingdom, and it shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favour in the sight of the king, if it please the king to grant my petition, fulfil my request." And here's her opportunity. She can say, "I want you to save my people." But no, the timing's not right. The timing is not right. So what does she say? "I want you to come back tomorrow for another party. Come back tomorrow, you and Haman. I want to have another banquet with you." What is this? This is banquet number 1. And the king says, "Okay, we'll be back." The idea was to tell the truth about what Haman was plotting while he was there, right in front of the king. But something happened. The timing wasn't right. And she said, "Okay, can we do this again tomorrow?" For whatever reason, the timing wasn't right. Now, Haman loved this. This was awesome. Having a private party with the king and the queen. Life doesn't get any better than this. This experience fitted into his ego so perfectly. And Haman left the feast feeling confident about himself and his achievement and where he was. Not only had Ahasuerus exalted him and lifted him up and agreed with his request to obliterate the Jews, but now the king and the queen had invited him not to one but to 2 exclusive parties. No higher honour could be given to any human than eating with the king, humanly speaking. Haman was on top of the world. So Haman heads back to his house. On the way he goes by the king's gate and he sees Mordecai and he just goes crazy with rage. I've just had this amazing experience and then I see this man that drives me nuts. That just makes me so cranky. So now we've got another irrational person in our story, don't we? And he goes home and he says, I've got to get rid of this man. So I'm going to erect a gallows and I'm just going to execute him tomorrow. A perfect solution. This descendant of Saul, this Jew, that night Haman slept soundly. This is amazing. And he dreamt of his revenge the next day. On the other hand, the king is back in the palace and he tosses and turns. Chapter 6 now. He tosses and turns and turns and tosses and he counts sheep and he can't go to sleep. Whatever the cause of his insomnia, he does a really strange thing. He calls for the royal records to be read to him. Go get the royal records, he says. I want the diary. Bring it to me. Let's read it. He'd been reigning for years and the royal records went back before him to his father and his grandfather. And there could be a lot of days to choose from. Somebody went and got the diaries and brought them to his bedroom. I guess he thought that, like counting sheep, that the monotony of the royal records, like reading the phone book, could put him to sleep. So somebody brings the royal records and he starts to read. And what he reads is the account of Mordecai's action to expose those two eunuchs, the two co-conspirators that plotted to kill him. That story, remember, we said how important it was to remember that it was written in the royal records. Chapter 6, verse 2 and 3. It was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthan and Teresh, the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on the king. And the king said, did we ever do the right thing? What dignity, what honour has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing's been done for him. Nothing. 5 years before, Mordecai had reported the plot and was never rewarded. King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus says, we've got to fix this. So when the morning comes, Haman arrives back at the royal court as early as he can, where he works, and he's busting to go into the king and ask the king if he can authorise the execution of Mordecai, and he's going to go in and get permission to hang Mordecai. But before he can say anything, Ahasuerus asks him a question. Chapter 6, verse 6. What shall be done for a man who the king delights to honour? Haman thinks it's him. What do I do for a man I want to honour? Oh, Haman says, give him a royal robe. Let's put a really nice coat on him and let him ride one of the king's horses and let him have a prince to lead him through the city, proclaiming to the whole city, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honour. And he's imagining himself, poor old Mordecai swinging from the gallows, and he's riding through the city dressed in the king's finest robes, riding the king's best horse, with a prince going before him, saying, look at this guy. The king likes this guy. This guy is important to the king. In a shocking twist of expectation, Ahasuerus says, great idea. Hurry then. Take the robe, get the horse that you've suggested, and do this to Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate, and leave nothing undone that you have spoken. Things aren't working out now the way that Haman wanted them to work out. Humiliation, shame, rage. Haman has no choice. So he is the guy who has to lead the parade for Mordecai through the city. And everywhere he goes, he says, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honour. probably the hardest words he ever said in his entire life. When the whole disgraceful thing is over, he goes home. He's looking for comfort from his family and friends, and he does not find it. Verse 13 of chapter 6, when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends of everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. They're saying, Haman, you're in trouble. If this is a Jewish man that is being so honoured by the king, and you're trying to wipe him and all of his people out, you're on the wrong side of the issue. This is not going to end well. The tables turned. In confusion, Haman goes back to the palace the same day to the second banquet, trying to steady his heart rate. He sits down for another horrifying surprise. The king, again overwhelmed by his affection for his queen, asks her what she wants. And here, at the second banquet, she does not hesitate. Chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favour in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. The king couldn't believe what he was hearing. Who would threaten the queen's life? Height of treason. The king is absolutely furious. Who is he? Where is he? Who dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? Sitting at the table, Haman. The noose is tightening around his neck. Surely, he thinks, the queen is not a Jew. And then, with her hand pointed at the red-faced dinner guest, she says, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. The king is gorged with fury. He gets up and he storms out into the palace garden. And he remembered the empire-wide decree that Haman had gotten him to authorise a couple of months earlier. And now Haman had misrepresented the Jewish people as a potential threat to the empire. And he had literally signed a decree into law that involved the murder of his own queen. Well, Haman, still at the dinner table, falls at Esther's feet in front of the couch where she sat, and he begged for his life. When the king came back in, he saw this, and blinded by anger, he sees that Haman is at the feet of his queen, pleading for mercy, and it looks like Haman is actually trying to assault the queen. Will he also assault the queen with me in the house? And instantly the royal guards covered Haman's face, and they led him away to be executed. And how did they kill him? They hung him from the gallows that he built for Mordecai. What a difference a day makes. It's amazing. 24 hours ago, he was on top. That was yesterday. Today, the king says, take all his property and give it to the queen. And the queen gave it to Mordecai. And the king exalted Mordecai, chapter 8, verse 2. Chapter 9, verse 4, the king exalted Mordecai, and he became to the king of Persia like Daniel had been to the king of Babylon. What was he going to do about the decree to kill the Jews? Because once a king has made a decree, he can't rescind the decree. What's he going to do? Chapter 9, verse 3 and 4, all of the officials in the provinces and the satraps and the governors and all those who do the king's work helped the Jews because of the fear of Mordecai now fell upon them because he had been so elevated. The king made a decree that the Jews could now defend themselves. So he didn't stop the massacre from happening. He said, you can take a sword and take a shield and do what you got to do. Doomsday came, March 7, 473 BC. and the Jews defended themselves. There were attacks, there were deaths. Over 75,000 of the enemies of the Jews were slain as the Jews defended themselves. And the king backed them up. Long after Haman was hanged, Mordecai and Esther continued to flourish in the royal house of the king. The king exalted Mordecai, as we said, to second in command and continued to love the queen. At this point, we bring it to a conclusion. We've gone way over time, but it's a beautiful story. We can't ignore it. Where is God in the book of Esther? Who is the real hero in the story? The real power behind the story is never mentioned, but it is God. His hand of providence is manifest in every single tiny detail. His presence is more powerfully and dominantly visible here than maybe in any other story of this complexity in Scripture, though he's never mentioned. His providence is at work in filtering down 25 million women to one, a Jew chosen to be queen. His providence is demonstrated in Mordecai being in a place where he could overhear a plot and warn the king. His providence, his power, his superintending sovereignty can be seen in the night that the king can't sleep and decides to read the royal record. See, that's why the queen couldn't tell them at the first banquet. The king needed to hear the story that night, didn't he? And out of all that could be read to the king that night is the story of Mordecai. Of books and books and books of records, that one story is the story that's read out. And even poor old Haman's timing is perfect in the purposes of God. The invisible hand of God is evident everywhere. Everywhere in this story. The absence of the name of God in this book, I think, might even be intentional. It's an ingenious strategy by the writer to draw the reader to think deeply about how life's circumstances are ordered to the divine purpose. These are not coincidences. There are too many. This is not random. There is a designer, there is a coordinator, there is a power behind all of this. God literally thunders through the book of Esther. There are no miracles in the book of Esther, but the whole thing is a miracle of divine providence. People, places, time, action. It's more than miraculous, my friends. Not Haman, not Satan using Haman could destroy the people of God, could put an end to the Abrahamic and the Davidic promises, to the promises of the preservation of the nation for the coming of the Messiah and the ultimate salvation of God's people. No one, no matter how they attempt to destroy the people of God and the purpose of God, can succeed, because God's covenant and love of Israel will be fulfilled, is being fulfilled. And the message for you is this: while you're going through life and trying to make sure you fix all the little pieces of your life, understand this, that there is over and in and above and below your life the divine architect ordering every detail. And if you belong to him and are in the covenant of his love, he is accomplishing his perfect will, and you can rest in that. You can rest in that. The Lord is still on his throne. These are challenging times, challenging days to live in. You can become pretty distressed about the way things are going. The way things are going in the world is chaotic and disconcerting and troubling and disturbing and distressing. In some ways it's very frightening, Not so in the kingdom, my friends, not so in the kingdom. The divine architect is ordering our lives, those of us who belong to him and are in covenant love with him. He is ordering our lives to his eternal glory. Who knows? Who knows? Why are you here? Why have you come here for such a time as this? How wonderful to live in that confidence. Amen. Amen.